Welcome to MSL Talk with Tom Caravela, a podcast specifically designed for MSLs and all things field medical. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. My guests today are Carolan and Giancarlo Maranzano, both with Boehringer Ingelheim. Carrie is Executive Director, Clinical Development and Medical Affairs, and Giancarlo is Team Leader, Field-Based Medicine. And we discussed the misalignment in clinical development and field medical. Really interesting conversation. Hope you guys enjoy it. Don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, follow us on Instagram, and check us out on MSL Talk Live, which is the first Tuesday of every month at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out our videos on YouTube. And as always, appreciate you all. Thank you for listening. Carrie and Giancarlo, welcome to the podcast. How you guys doing?
Great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so excited. And for those of you joining us, I know Carrie a long time. We've worked together in a lot of different capacities, but this has been months in the making. I mean, we tried to get this scheduled a couple of times, and she's super busy, and there were just scheduling conflicts on both sides. But so I am really excited that we're finally doing this. Before we get started, quick shout out to our friends in the Czech Republic. We have a tremendous listener base in the Czech Republic. I think we were ranked 6th in the careers category last week. So shout out to those guys. And as we always do, I'm going to have Carrie and Giancarlo do an introduction so that we can get to know them a little bit before we get started.
Great. Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. And thanks for letting me invite Giancarlo. We do a lot of integral work together. So I think this is going to be really great for us to do together. And as you mentioned, we've known each other a really long time, maybe too long. So I'm glad that we were able to get this together and do this today. My name is Karen. I am currently the Executive Director and Therapeutic Area Head for all of CNS and retinal health at Boehringer Ingelheim. Just want to make sure that we say that anything that we go through today reflects mine and Giancarlo's many years of experience in our roles and does not necessarily reflect that of the company we work for. So just have to throw that out there, but really excited to be here and look forward to having this conversation. And I'll pass it over to Giancarlo.
Great, thanks, Carrie. And thanks, Tom, for having me as well. Really excited to be chatting with you today. So I'm a team leader, field-based medicine, CNS here at Boehringer Ingelheim. Been with the company now for, about 10 years at this point. And, I've had a number of different roles, both in the field and home office medical affairs, and now in team leadership in field-based medicine. So really thrilled to be here and talk through our topics.
Awesome. Well, congratulations, Giancarlo, and welcome to you both. So let's jump right into it. And Carrie, you and I were having a conversation about this on the phone, and it was really interesting to see you had talked about some of the gaps between clinical development and field medical affairs. And I'm curious as to how prevalent that is, and if you could talk about that piece of it, just to introduce this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. Through the years, I've held many roles, starting with being in field-based medical and managing one team, then multiple teams. And one of the things I really appreciate about what we're able to do now is that instead of the complete separation of clinical development and medical affairs, I'm able to work kind of across both. And so it really gives us an opportunity to kind of look at where we are with clinical development and how could our field-based colleagues and how could us in internal clinical development medical affairs, which is my team, really work intricately together to come out with better opportunities for patients, for recruitment, for studies and things like that. And so, coming here and realizing that we can do a combined effort really makes a difference and really made me realize how large that gap is, because typically field-based medical, clinical development, and medical affairs are all very distinct departments and very separate. And a lot of times you don't see any integration at all.
And isn't that the norm? Wouldn't you say that the norm is that there isn't integration? It's totally firewalled or siloed, I don't know, however you want to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And I mean, clinical development really is very, very separate. I mean, I can think of past companies I've worked for, and we really had no involvement and overlap with clinical development at all. I mean, we didn't meet together, we didn't do programs together, we really didn't integrate at all. Medical affairs sometimes integrates better with field-based medical. Those seem to be more closely aligned from my past experience, but really bringing that clinical development component into it, and as a strategist, really allowed me to think through how can we use our field-based medical colleagues and how can we give them opportunities and really enrich our own experience as internal in-house positions to really do a better job all the way around.
And how are you guys doing it? So let's talk a little bit, maybe Giancarlo, if you can let us know, how are you guys doing it and how might that be different from the norm? Like what can folks listening to this take away from what you guys are doing as maybe best practices or maybe a different way that they might be able to do it in their organizations?
Yeah, look, I think that the factors that drive what the relationship between these various departments we're talking about can look like can be rooted in, certainly the culture of the company, maybe the structure, and sometimes even sort of the years of maturity of the Department of Field-Based Medicine in particular, and life cycle of product or life cycle of the therapeutic area that you're talking about. And I think for early asset pipeline therapeutic areas, the concept of field medical being a field-based extension of the medical affairs teams is one that I think is probably most prominent. So I think in the pipeline space, I think that the opportunity for integration is greatest. The inline space, when you have product on the market, your priorities are going to be a little different, right? The strategies are going to be focused more on supporting a singular product or product with multiple indications, et cetera. In a case like ours, I think you're talking about a field medical affairs team and a home office medical affairs team that's dedicated across a whole portfolio of very distinct spaces. And I think that, for us, the successes that we've seen thus far are really based on that, again, integration across the portfolio and supporting the various departments that right now are kind of our key customers internally, right? The folks that are dedicated and accountable to executing clinical trials, as an example that we're talking about here. There are a number of ways how field medical and home office medical affairs can support those processes, in addition to the clinical development, strategies and focuses that are relevant today, but also in the future. And I think a lot of that's driven by the insights that we can bring to the company, again, by way of not only the team in the fields, but the home office team as well.
Yeah. And Carrie, you've been with other organizations. You've been around the industry long enough to see a lot of different models. So what do you think is missing, and what could companies do strategically to do a better job with this?
I mean, honestly, one of the aha moments I had in coming here and really being charged with overseeing both was really looking at, to Giancarlo's point, our early stage development portfolio and those things where we're in a phase 2 or phase 3 study. And so typically, medical affairs doesn't get utilized necessarily to be involved in any of those early development projects. And for me, I saw this as really an opportunity to get our field-based medical colleagues who have, number one, a lot of experience and integral relationships already established with academic medical centers, with HCPs with large practices, for instance, with key opinion leaders that also might be PIs, and say, how can we leverage their background and experience and those connections that they bring into the clinical development realm to say, could these be additional trial sites for us? Could these be additional principal investigators? Or do these investigators have a team of sub-investigators, for instance, where they say, hey, we could be a trial site, and it's a naive trial site, meaning it's not somebody who's on our radar. It's not somebody who we already have in our queue that we do a lot of studies with. And so utilizing the field medical team as a resource to connect us with people in the field that they already know and people that they might go out and meet that we don't know could be potential sites, PIs, things like that. And then bringing those back and connecting those field-based medical colleagues to our clinical operations teams, for instance, and through my team to understand, so we all work together to say, how can we produce a better product? How can we find more sites? And how can we benefit more patients by doing it this way?
Yeah, interesting. And I think just getting back, I think it really kind of all depends on where the company is in their life cycle and where they sit in their drug development and clinical development. This might not even apply to certain companies,
Right.
but in companies where it does apply, let's expand on what you just said, Carrie and Giancarlo. What would you say as far as the MSLs themselves? Let's look at the tactical side of things. Like, how can this be further implemented through the MSLs? What can their role be, and what are some of the things they would be doing?
Yeah, I think structure of how the teams are pulling information in is, in my experience, something very critical to how best you can sort of address gaps. And if you let's take the example of, pulling insights about a given, I don't know, data set or something that's out there. Having a very structured way for the MSLs to capture feedback from the experts that they engage with, that then in turn allows, internal either management teams or others to interpret those results and that feedback in a very systematic way, really in many cases quantifying the feedback. I think that's really helpful. And I think visualizing even the feedback that you get can help tell a story, because at the end of the day, right, we're all human and we want to tell a story about what, in this case, what we're hearing in the field. And I think having that structure is something that's very, very critical to doing that. So from a tactical perspective, that's certainly something that I've seen work in the past, and having these sort of structured ways of capturing information and then reporting it out. I think also when you switch gears into the conversation of clinical operations and site follow-up and identification, again, that same guiding principle of structure applies. And Carrie and I have worked on a couple of ideas as to how best we can establish a process where we can gain information about potential sites and share that with individuals internally as necessary and as applicable. Because at the end of the day, when you work for a very matrixed organization, there are different departments and players and levers that have to get pulled. And being at least buttoned up and as structured as possible on the front end, I think allows the best chance for that kind of information and insight to travel to the desk that it needs to get to internally. Yeah. Right. So those are my thoughts there.
And a lot of this sounds like traditional MSL work. It's gathering insights and being a conduit is what MSLs are. It's MSLing. That's what MSLs do. Is there anything here, Carrie, you mentioned recruitment, patient recruitment. How does that fit into this? Is that something that you would suggest that field medical get more involved in? Is that just something that is way outside the purview of what you think an MSL could or should do? Or should that be a separate team? Like maybe there's an MSL team and there's a CSL team, because we're seeing different things pop up. So I want to get your perspective on how this all kind of fits together in what might be either the MSL role, or if it should be maybe broken out in some way.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, and I think that goes back to looking at your pipeline life cycle. How many assets do you have? How closely related are those assets, or how vastly different are they, for instance? And so, I've done it both ways actually myself. I've hired teams of CSLs. We've had distinct teams of MSLs. For super large scale studies, for instance, where there's a ton of sites and you may not have the bandwidth on an MSL team to say, I can't necessarily visit my KEs and my academic experts and things that I need to do from an MSL perspective, and then also go out to all of these CROs and clinical trial sites and things like that. But in the case where you are starting, or you're new, or you have a pipeline that's very closely aligned, and maybe you have a few programs that all could benefit from maybe overlap with sites for some of the differential trials that you have, but the sites could recruit patients in one or more different trials, then it makes sense to use our MSL teams, because they're already out in the field and they know those territories. It, number one, gives them exposure to things other than the traditional MSL type interactions they might have. Number two, it gives them insight into how does the trial work and how do the drugs that they're disseminating data on, whether it's preclinical data, phase 2, phase 3 data, or post-marketing data, how do those come to approval? And I think that whole picture and giving them a picture of not just one aspect of what they do, but really more of a circular full picture is beneficial for everybody concerned, because most MSLs don't get exposed to drug development necessarily.
Well,
and
and
they
that,
may not know the process of how it works.
well, and that was literally leads into my next question, which is where's like, how does the training aspect of this work, and what obstacles are there, Giancarlo, in having an MSL team and then saying, okay, well, we're going to be doing this now, or we're bringing on an MSL team to do this. What are we looking for when we hire and recruit these MSLs? So it's, it could be on the hiring side, or it could be on the training side, or both. Curious, like, how does that work?
Yeah, I know. Great questions. I think starting from the perspective of building the team and sort of identifying what the kind of key characteristics are and competencies. Again, when I think about early life cycle and building a new therapeutic area and sort of forging new territory for a company, hiring people with experience in that space is critical, and understanding kind of the science of it, the medicine. Ideally, if you've done the role of an MSL before, I think that's quite helpful. We certainly have, I think, also examples of where having experience in the therapeutic area without the MSL experience is very helpful as well, because you've got that really recent clinical experience that you can apply, and the savvy that you can kind of carry yourself with in a meeting with experts externally that is particularly helpful. So from the training aspect, either one of those two types of individuals, goes through training, I'd say, quite well in terms of the science and the data and all that stuff. When it comes to the business of clinical development, I think, to your point and the point that's being made here, this one is not so easy to read from a book, the proverbial book. So one of the things that I think has been particularly helpful in my experience is sort of socializing the concept of the MSL with colleagues that are going to be integrated partners with us. And so again, I go to the clinical operations colleagues. Again, depending on life cycle, those ClinOps colleagues may never have worked with an MSL. They may not know really what the MSL does, what they're allowed to do. Even that can sometimes change, year over year at a company, right? So for me, in recent experience, I think important to have those conversations with respective point people on given clinical trial programs in the respective country that you're working in, getting them to very clearly understand the roles that the team has. I've found some, I think we've found some success in having point people, so point MSLs on a team, to be sort of the conduits between the clinical trial teams and the field medical team, such that you can have the sort of ongoing relationship build with those folks, ensure that information is being shared, in a consistent fashion. And again, I go back to that structural concept, or that concept, I should say, of structure, that really helps in folks understanding what it is that you do, maybe more importantly, what it is that you don't do, right? Like we're also not trying to intentionally, overstep boundaries and take on accountabilities that aren't within the scope of our roles. But I think, really championing the efforts that we, or I should say, championing the potential benefit that the MSL teams can add to partners like this internally, clinical operations as an example, has been really important for us. And so organically, the understanding of how clinical development is done comes through that process. So it's a bit of a crucible when it comes to getting up to speed on that.
Yeah, that's great. That's good info. So I can't help but think, and I'm going to get back to a strategic question for you, Carrie. I can't help but think that when it's hard enough in medical affairs, each company does things differently. There's really no standards, but when it comes to metrics and performance, obviously that's something that everybody does differently depending on the organization. As it relates to this type of scenario, how do you go about the evaluation and metrics of field medical, and what's included? Is there, do you quantify this in some way? Is it more quality based? I'm just curious as to how this all fits in.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and since this is like not a typical, and we, Giancarlo and I kind of brainstormed and decided that this would be something great to bring to our clinical operations team, because remember, being a global company, most of all of these things and all the trials, the protocols are all spearheaded out of a global organization. And there's, different point people that actually are responsible from a global standpoint versus an OPU, whether it's US or Japan or China or different OPU standpoint. And so they have the big picture, right? They know what's going on in all the countries, how many sites they want in every country, how many patients are expected, for instance, in a trial. Whereas each OPU might only have line of sight from a clinical operations standpoint of what we're supposed to be, quote, doing in the US. And so one of the things we can brainstorm, because there would be no formal metrics since we created this from scratch, this model, is to say, how do we measure success? And if we have our clinical operations team, for instance, saying, look, we expect your OPU, whomever you are, let's say US, that's where we are, to have, we need 15 sites and we need X number of patients and what have you. And then they find out, for instance, in our current state of affairs in the world, that we have a war going on, that we have sites in countries that no longer can effectively recruit patients for a study, let's say. Or they withdraw and say, look, for whatever reason, we're not going to do this. They can come back to us and say, hey, you know what? We need to up that now. We now need 25 sites, for instance. So things change, right? This is not a static environment. And things are constantly changing based on where we are in the world and what the situation is. And so we came up with a model where, as Giancarlo mentioned, he assigned a lead to each of our different therapeutic spaces that we might have trials going on in. They'll funnel those through him and he and I, and then I will put our US and global colleagues in clinical operations. So we have a tracking of who is it that we identified through our field-based medical and medical affairs teams, whether they came from my team or field-based medical and Giancarlo's team.
We're starting to lose Carrie a little bit. Yeah, we lost you there for a second.
Did I lose you?
Yeah, I lost you there for a second.
Okay. So I'm not sure you lost me, but basically, having an ability to track it through where I would send this up through our US and maybe our global colleagues so that we can say, look, here are some new sites, here are some new potential PIs, and then be able to track this. So Giancarlo can track it through his team to see what the responses are. How many of these PIs and or sites actually come on board and become affected based on the work that they're doing in the field.
Got you. Yeah, no, that's good insights. And it sounds like there's a lot of more of a qualitative approach to that in a sense. So hearing that, I'm curious, Giancarlo, what does good look like for you? So your MSLs are out there, they're doing their thing. How do they get your attention? What do you feel like, wow, that's what I'm looking for?
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's a balance of the quantitative and qualitative components of sort of performance evaluations. I think for me, we again are in a very different space than a team that's supporting a marketed product and that has different channels perhaps of potential opportunities to engage with experts in the external community than we would have, right? We don't have it's just a different world. And at the same time, a group like this one is, focused more on, investigators and folks that maybe know the company that you're with based on their experience in doing research with them. So I think there will always be that quantitative component of field activity related to the MSL role. I think that a framework of competencies to give you a better perspective from the qualitative standpoint of how the MSL is engaging with partners internally, externally, is important. That framework really should also kind of get an understanding of, how well the individual is, kind of leveraging the tools they have at their disposal. And tools can be many different things, right? Everything from resources to, their territory routing and things of that nature. So I think that, folks that get my attention are the ones that are able to really, produce some really meaningful insights, number one, because I think that's the currency, certainly, of what MSLs do. And those insights can be, directed at supporting the clinical trials or informing clinical, medical strategy moving through the life cycle of the TA that you're in. And I think that, folks that are really able to articulate, sorry for the background noise, folks that are really able to articulate kind of the information that they're pulling in from experts and have that kind of direct line to those folks to really kind of quickly follow up on something, whatever that something is, that really shows that they know their territory and that they know, the business that they have around them in their region. So I think it's a combination of all those things.
Awesome. Good stuff. So Carrie, final thoughts. Any other things you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important points is, that we're constantly, as a strategist, we're constantly looking for ways that we can really collaborate, across our different therapeutic areas, across our US and global team, in the spirit of collaboration. Like, how do we help other colleagues within our company in the job that they're trying to do? So it really, goes beyond what is it that my role is or my team's role is. How is it that we can bring other people in to learn new things, be able to be effective and demonstrate their value beyond what it might say their quote job is or their job description is. And how do we demonstrate to people in other areas that may not be familiar, especially to the point of this conversation, the field-based medical role, how valuable those teams can be and the different and variety of roles that they can play to really help affect positive outcomes for things that otherwise companies often may struggle with, depending on the climate, depending on the time of year, the patient population, what it is you're seeking, and all the other variables that go along with it. So we're constantly striving for opportunities to work more integrally together and affect better outcomes for all of us as colleagues and ultimately for the patients who will benefit from the things that we're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate your innovation and how you guys are doing anything. So Giancarlo, I'll let you finish it off. Any final thoughts?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think, I would echo everything that Carrie just mentioned. I would, only add that I think that we really have an opportunity within the industry, within the pharmaceutical industry, to highlight the benefit and better understand the benefit of medical affairs at large in early asset teams. I think there's kind of that tendency to, apply resources a bit closer to a launch, but I do think there are some real tangible reasons to consider much earlier intervention of personnel, not only in the home office, but in the field too.
Yeah, man. Hey, hire MSLs early and often. That just helps my business.
Fair enough. Yeah.
No, that's a great way to end it. You guys are awesome. This was really, we haven't done anything like this. So this was really insightful. I appreciate both of you. And I want to wish you continued success. You guys are rock stars. And I think you're doing some really awesome stuff. So thank you for joining us. I want to thank everybody else for listening. Once again, if you got value in this, please share it. This is the fastest growing podcast on the planet, consistently ranked top 2% globally. And that's because you guys are sharing it and you guys are listening. And I really, really appreciate that. So we're going to have to do this again, guys. We're going to have to do Carrie and Giancarlo part 2.
We'll do it. Thanks for having us. Thanks for the invite. And we're always happy to help if there's something that we can do to work with you. Always great to see you and work with you.
Yeah, start thinking of topics.
We will do that.
All right, guys. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for listening to the show. And if you enjoyed it, please subscribe so that you don't miss an episode in the future. And feel free to leave a rating or a review or a comment. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you soon.